What would you do if you found a dying grizzly bear cub collapsed on your doorstep? Most people would call animal control and keep their distance. After all, where there's a cub, there's usually a very protective mother nearby. But when farmer Jake Morrison opened his door that cold October morning in rural Montana, he didn't see a dangerous predator. He saw a helpless creature fighting for its life. What happened next would not only change both their lives forever, but challenge everything we think we know about the relationship between humans and one of nature's most feared animals. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to catch more heartwarming stories like this one. The morning mist was still clinging to the peaks of the Glacier National Park foothills when Jake Morrison stepped outside his remote farmhouse to check on his cattle. At 58, Jake had lived on this isolated 200-acre ranch for over 3 decades. He'd seen his share of wildlife: elk wandering through his pastures, mountain lions padding silently through the shadows, even the occasional black bear rummaging through his garbage. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found huddled against his front door. There, barely breathing and covered in mud and dried blood, lay a grizzly bear cub no bigger than a golden retriever puppy. Its tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate gasps. Its fur, which should have been thick and golden brown in preparation for winter, was matted and dull. But it was the cub's eyes that stopped Jake in his tracks. Dark, intelligent, and filled with a kind of exhaustion that spoke of unimaginable struggle. Jake's first instinct was exactly what you'd expect from a seasoned rancher. He scanned the tree line, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every wildlife expert, every park ranger, every local had drilled the same message into residents like him. Never approach a bear cub. The mother is always nearby, and a protective grizzly sow is one of the most dangerous forces in nature. A fully grown female grizzly can weigh up to 400 pounds, run 35 miles per hour, and has a bite force of over 1,000 pounds per square inch. They've been known to flip cars and tear through cabin walls to protect their young. But as Jake stood there, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air, he realized something was wrong with this picture. The forest around his property was completely silent. No rustling in the underbrush, no heavy breathing or warning growls, no massive paw prints in the soft earth around his porch. This cub was utterly and heartbreakingly alone. Jake knelt down slowly, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he reached toward the tiny creature. The cub didn't even flinch, a sign that it was either too weak to run or too young to fear humans yet. Up close, Jake could see that this wasn't just exhaustion. The cub was severely malnourished, its ribs visible through its fur. There were scratches along its back legs, and one of its paws was swollen and tender. This little one had been wandering alone for days, maybe weeks. "Where's your mama, little guy?" Jake whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. The cub's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, and Jake saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, a flicker of hope. This tiny, wild creature, who should have been terrified of humans, looked at him with what could only be described as trust. It was as if the cub somehow knew that Jake was its last chance. To understand how this remarkable story began, we need to go back 6 weeks earlier, deep in the heart of Glacier National Park. It was late August, and a grizzly sow named Honey by the park researchers had been successfully raising her 2 cubs through their first summer. At 4 months old, the cubs, a male and female, were thriving under their mother's careful protection. Honey was an experienced mother, this being her 3rd litter. She knew the rhythms of the wilderness like a symphony. She taught her cubs which berries were safe to eat,
how to fish in the rushing mountain streams, and most importantly, how to avoid the two-legged creatures that sometimes invaded their territory. For the cubs, life was an endless adventure of play, learning, and the comfort of their mother's warm embrace during the cool mountain nights. But the wilderness can be cruel and unpredictable. In early September, a series of devastating forest fires began to sweep through the region. What started as a small lightning strike quickly exploded into an inferno that would consume over 50,000 acres of pristine forest. The fires moved fast, faster than anyone anticipated. Wildlife officials later pieced together what happened through GPS collar data and thermal imaging from helicopters fighting the fires. Honey and her cubs were foraging near Bowman Lake when the winds suddenly shifted, trapping them in a narrow valley as walls of flame closed in from 3 directions. In the chaos and terror that followed, the family became separated. Search and rescue teams found Honey's remains 3 days later, along with the body of the female cub. They had been overcome by smoke inhalation while trying to reach higher ground. But there was no sign of the male cub. For weeks, helicopters and ground teams searched the charred landscape, but the little survivor seemed to have vanished into the wilderness. What they didn't know was that the cub, weighing barely 40 pounds and still dependent on his mother's milk, had been wandering aimlessly through the burned forest for nearly a month. He survived by drinking from muddy puddles, eating charcoal-covered berries, and sleeping in hollow logs. But as the days turned to weeks and the nights grew colder, the cub grew weaker. His body began shutting down from malnutrition and dehydration. Driven by some deep survival instinct, the cub began moving toward the smell of wood smoke and cooking food, the scent of human habitation. For 3 days, he stumbled through the wilderness, following his nose toward Jake Morrison's remote ranch. By the time he collapsed on Jake's doorstep, he had less than 24 hours to live. Standing there on his porch, holding a dying grizzly cub in his arms, Jake Morrison faced an impossible choice. The legal thing to do was clear: call Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks immediately. They would send a team to collect the cub and either transport it to a wildlife rehabilitation facility or, more likely, given its condition, humanely euthanize it. That was the protocol. That was what everyone expected. But as Jake looked into those trusting brown eyes, he couldn't bring himself to make that call. Not yet. "You need help, don't you, buddy?" he whispered, gently stroking the cub's matted fur. Jake carried the cub inside his farmhouse, wrapping it in an old wool blanket and placing it near the wood-burning stove. The cub's breathing was so shallow that Jake had to put his ear close to its chest to make sure it was still alive. Its body temperature was dangerously low, and it hadn't eaten for who knows how long. Now, Jake Morrison wasn't a wildlife expert. He'd never raised anything more exotic than barn cats and cattle, but he'd grown up on this land, and he'd developed an intuitive understanding of animals in distress. More importantly, he had something that couldn't be taught: a deep wellspring of compassion that wouldn't let him give up on any creature in need. Jake's first priority was warmth and hydration. He prepared a mixture of warm water, honey, and a small amount of whole milk, not ideal for a bear cub, but better than nothing. Using a baby bottle he'd kept from when he helped raise orphaned calves, he managed to get a few ounces of the mixture into the cub's system. The response was almost immediate. The cub's breathing became slightly stronger, and for the first time since Jake found him, he opened his eyes and showed interest in his surroundings. It wasn't much, but it was hope.
On the second night, something magical happened. As Jake sat in his armchair reading, Smokey, who had been sleeping on a pile of blankets nearby, slowly got to his feet and walked over to Jake's chair. Without hesitation, the cub climbed up and curled into Jake's lap, letting out a small, contented sigh before falling back asleep. In that moment, Jake knew there was no going back. This wasn't just about saving a wild animal anymore. Somehow, inexplicably, they had found each other. What Jake did next would shock wildlife experts and authorities alike. Instead of calling for help, he made a decision that would define the next chapter of both their lives. He decided to raise Smokey himself, in secret, on his remote ranch. Jake knew the risks. Keeping a grizzly bear, even a cub, without proper permits was a federal offense that could result in heavy fines and prison time. If Fish and Wildlife discovered what he was doing, they would confiscate Smokey immediately, and Jake would likely face prosecution. But more than that, Jake was acutely aware that he was attempting something that most experts would consider impossible and dangerous. Grizzly bears aren't pets. They're apex predators with complex nutritional and behavioral needs. As they grow, they become incredibly strong and potentially dangerous even to those who raised them. Most wildlife rehabilitation facilities won't even attempt to raise orphaned grizzly cubs because the success rate is so low and the risks so high. But Jake had advantages that most people wouldn't. His ranch was isolated, surrounded by hundreds of acres of wilderness. His nearest neighbor was 12 miles away. He had decades of experience with large animals, and perhaps most importantly, he had the kind of patience and intuitive understanding that can't be learned from textbooks. The first few weeks were the most critical. Jake converted an old storage shed into a bear-proofed nursery, complete with thick walls, reinforced doors, and a secure outdoor pen. He researched everything he could about bear nutrition, spending hours online learning about the specific dietary needs of growing cubs. Smokey's diet evolved from the honey milk mixture to a carefully planned regimen of fish, berries, nuts, and specially formulated supplements that Jake ordered online. He planted berry bushes around the property and dug a small pond where he could teach Smokey to fish, skills that would be essential if the cub were ever to survive in the wild. But it wasn't just about physical needs. Jake instinctively understood that Smokey needed emotional support to overcome the trauma of losing his mother and family. He spent hours each day playing with the cub, teaching him through gentle interaction and positive reinforcement. When Smokey had nightmares, yes, bears can have nightmares, Jake would comfort him just like he would a frightened child. The bond that developed between them was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. Smokey followed him everywhere around the ranch, helping with chores, playing in the fields, and always returning to Jake's side when he felt uncertain or afraid. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, Jake reading or whittling, while Smokey dozed contentedly at his feet. As autumn turned to winter, Smokey grew stronger and more confident. His fur became thick and lustrous, his eyes bright and intelligent. He learned to forage for food, to fish in the pond, and to climb the tall pine trees that surrounded the property. Most importantly, he retained his natural wariness of strangers while maintaining his deep trust in Jake. But Jake knew this arrangement couldn't last forever. Smokey was growing fast. By spring, he would weigh over 200 pounds and be approaching his first birthday. Soon, his natural instincts would become stronger, and the call of the wilderness would become impossible to ignore. Jake managed to keep Smokey secret for nearly 8 months. Through the harsh Montana winter, while the cub hibernated in a specially constructed den, Jake continued to care for him and plan for an uncertain future. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially in small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. It was Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife biologist with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, who first spotted the unusual tracks around Jake's property during a routine survey in early spring. Sarah had been studying bear populations in the region for over a decade, and she immediately recognized that these prints were different. They were too large for a black bear, clearly from a grizzly, but the pattern was wrong. Instead of random wandering tracks of a wild bear, these prints showed a regular circuit around human habitation, behavior that suggested either a problem bear that needed to be relocated or something much more unusual. Sarah returned with a team 3 days later, armed with trail cameras and tracking equipment. What they captured on film shocked them. There, clear as day, was a year-old grizzly bear playing in a farmer's yard, responding to human calls, and behaving more like a domestic dog than a wild predator. The confrontation came on a warm April morning. Jake was outside working on his tractor when 3 government vehicles pulled up his long driveway. His heart sank when he recognized the Fish and Wildlife Service logos on the doors. Smokey, now weighing nearly 250 pounds, but still behaving like an oversized puppy, was napping in the shade of an old oak tree nearby. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Chen said as she approached, her voice professional but not unkind. "We need to talk." What followed was one of the most difficult conversations of Jake's life. Dr. Chen and her team had come to confiscate Smokey and potentially arrest Jake for violating federal wildlife protection laws. They had tranquilizer guns, transport cages, and all the paperwork necessary to remove the bear immediately. But as they talked, something unexpected happened. Dr. Chen, who had seen hundreds of bears in her career, began to observe the remarkable relationship between Jake and Smokey. When Smokey woke up from his nap, he didn't react to the strangers with aggression or fear. He simply moved closer to Jake, clearly seeking comfort and guidance from the man that he considered his family. "This is unprecedented," she admitted, watching as Jake gently scratched behind Smokey's ears. "In all my years studying bears, I've never seen anything like this bond." Jake seized the moment. "He was dying when I found him," he explained, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I know I broke the law, but I couldn't just let him die. Look at him now. He's healthy, he's happy, and he's learned skills he'll need to survive in the wild." Dr. Chen was in an impossible position. By law, she should confiscate Smokey immediately. Keeping a grizzly bear without permits was a serious federal offense. But she was also a scientist, and what she was witnessing challenged everything she thought she knew about bear behavior and human-wildlife relationships. What Dr. Chen decided to do next would shock her colleagues and superiors back at headquarters. Instead of immediately confiscating Smokey, she asked Jake for 48 hours to evaluate the situation properly. She wanted to document this extraordinary relationship and determine whether Smokey could indeed be returned to the wild. Over the next 2 days, Dr. Chen observed Jake and Smokey together with the eye of a trained scientist. What she discovered was remarkable. Despite being raised by a human, Smokey had retained all of his natural bear instincts. He could fish, forage for food, climb trees, and demonstrate the complex problem-solving skills that wild bears need to survive. More importantly, he showed appropriate wariness of other humans while maintaining his bond with Jake. "This is textbook perfect rehabilitation," Dr. Chen confided to our team. "This bear has received better care and training than most professional facilities could provide." But there was still the legal issue. Jake had broken federal law, and there would have to be consequences. However, Dr. Chen had an idea that was as unconventional as Jake's decision to raise Smokey in the first place. She called her supervisor and made a proposal. Instead of prosecuting Jake, what if they offered him a partnership? His success with Smokey had demonstrated skills and insights that could be invaluable to wildlife rehabilitation efforts. Instead of working against each other, they could work together to help other orphaned bears.
3 weeks later, Dr. Chen returned to Jake's ranch with an unprecedented offer. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks wanted to establish a pilot program for grizzly bear rehabilitation, with Jake's ranch as the primary facility and Jake as the head caretaker. Instead of facing prosecution, Jake would receive official permits, funding, and support to continue doing what he'd already proven he could do extraordinarily well. The conditions were strict. Jake would have to complete extensive training in wildlife biology and bear behavior. His facility would be subject to regular inspections. Any bears in his care would ultimately be returned to the wild when they were ready, and Smokey would serve as the program's first success story. But the most amazing part of the agreement was what it meant for Smokey. Instead of being taken away from the only family he'd known, Smokey would stay with Jake while they prepared him for eventual release back into Glacier National Park. The bond they'd formed wouldn't be broken. It would become the foundation for helping other orphaned bears find their way back to the wilderness. The establishment of the Morrison Grizzly Rehabilitation Center transformed not just Jake's ranch, but his entire life. With funding from Fish and Wildlife Services, private donations, and conservation groups, Jake was able to expand his facilities and hire additional staff. Dr. Chen became a regular presence at the ranch, serving as both supervisor and partner in this groundbreaking program. Smokey, now officially designated as bear number 47 in the state's rehabilitation records, became both patient and teacher in the new facility. His calm demeanor and social skills made him an ideal companion for newly orphaned cubs that arrived at the center. Jake and Dr. Chen discovered that Smokey seemed to understand his role, gently playing with frightened cubs and helping them adjust to their temporary home. Over the following months, the center welcomed 6 more orphaned grizzly cubs, each with their own tragic backstory of loss and survival. There was Luna, found wandering Highway 2 after her mother was struck by a truck. There were the twins, Bear and Barely, discovered huddled together after a rock slide separated them from their family. Each cub presented unique challenges, but Jake's patient approach and Smokey's example helped them all begin the healing process. The rehabilitation process was carefully designed to prepare the bears for eventual release while maintaining their essential wildness. Jake worked with Dr. Chen to create environments that mimicked natural conditions as closely as possible. The bears learned to forage for natural foods, to fish in stocked ponds, and to interact with each other in ways that would help them integrate with wild bear populations. But perhaps most importantly, Jake learned to do something that went against every instinct he developed during those first precious months with Smokey. He learned to maintain emotional distance from the newer cubs. While Smokey would always hold a special place in his heart, Jake understood that the other bears needed to retain their natural fear of humans if they were going to survive in the wild. The program's success quickly gained national attention. Wildlife biologists, conservation groups, and media outlets began visiting the ranch to document this revolutionary approach to bear rehabilitation. Jake, who had lived his entire adult life in relative isolation, suddenly found himself at the center of a conservation movement that challenged traditional thinking about human-wildlife relationships. By the time Smokey reached his 2nd birthday, he weighed over 400 pounds and stood nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder. He was no longer the helpless cub that had collapsed on Jake's doorstep. He was a magnificent adult grizzly bear, strong, intelligent, and fully capable of surviving in the wild. The decision about when to release Smokey had been weighing on everyone's minds for months. Dr. Shan and her team had been monitoring his behavior, looking for signs that he was ready to leave the only home he'd known since infancy. The signs were subtle but unmistakable. Smokey was spending more time alone, showing less interest in human interaction, and displaying increased restlessness, especially during the early morning and evening hours when wild bears were most active. Jake knew this day was coming, had been preparing for it emotionally and practically for over a year.
But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally are two very different things. The thought of saying goodbye to Smokey felt like losing a son. The release was planned for early September, nearly 2 years to the day since Jake first found Smokey on his doorstep. The location chosen was a remote area of Glacier National Park, far from human activity, but rich in the natural food sources Smokey would need to establish his territory before winter hibernation. On the morning of the release, Jake woke before dawn and found Smokey already awake, sitting by the fence line looking toward the mountains. It was as if Smokey could sense that today was different, that the call of the wilderness was finally going to be answered. The transport to the release site was emotional but smooth. Smokey, now wearing a GPS collar that would allow researchers to monitor his progress, seemed calm but alert as they traveled deeper into the park. Jake rode in the transport vehicle, talking quietly to Smokey during the journey, telling him things he'd been wanting to say but hadn't found the words for. At the release site, Jake opened the transport cage and stepped back. For a moment, Smokey hesitated, looking back at Jake as if seeking permission or reassurance. Jake nodded and spoke the words he'd been practicing. "Go on, buddy. It's time." Smokey took a few tentative steps toward the forest, then turned back one more time. The look that passed between them in that moment contained 2 years of shared experiences, love, trust, and now, goodbye. Then Smokey turned and walked steadily into the wilderness, his massive form disappearing into the trees within minutes. Jake stood there for nearly an hour after Smokey vanished from sight, fighting back tears and listening to the sounds of the forest. Dr. Chen placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. She said, "You gave him the greatest gift possible. You gave him his freedom." The months following Smokey's release were anxious ones for Jake and the team. The GPS collar allowed them to track Smokey's movements, and the data was both encouraging and nerve-wracking. Smokey had successfully found a territory in a remote valley, was foraging effectively, and had even been spotted fishing in mountain streams. But the winter was approaching, and the real test would be whether he could successfully hibernate and emerge healthy in the spring. Meanwhile, the Morrison Grizzly Rehabilitation Center continued to grow. Word of the program's success had spread throughout the conservation community, and orphaned cubs began arriving from across the northwestern United States. Jake found himself caring for as many as 12 bears at a time, each requiring individualized attention and care. The winter passed slowly. Jake found himself checking Smokey's GPS location obsessively, even though he knew the bear would be deep in hibernation. When the signal went silent in November, indicating that Smokey had found a suitable den site, Jake felt both relief and profound loneliness. Spring brought the answer to everyone's prayers. In late March, Smokey's GPS collar came back online, showing movement from a den site high in the mountains. The signal was strong, and his movement patterns indicated a healthy, active bear beginning the post-hibernation process of finding food and re-establishing his territory. But the real confirmation came 6 weeks later, when park rangers, conducting a wildlife survey, captured footage of a massive male grizzly fishing in a remote stream. The bear showed no fear of the distant cameras, but also no interest in approaching humans. He was perfectly, beautifully wild, except for a small scar behind his left ear, a reminder of a vaccination he'd received during his time at the rehabilitation center. Dr. Chen called Jake immediately. She said, "It's him," she said with a voice filled with emotion. "He's not just surviving, Jake. He's thriving." Smokey's successful release created ripples that extended far beyond the borders of Glacier National Park. The Morrison Grizzly Rehabilitation Center became a model for similar programs across North America. Jake found himself consulting on rehabilitation projects in Alaska, Canada, and even as far as Romania, where brown bears faced similar challenges from habitat loss and human encroachment.
More importantly, the program began to change public perception about grizzly bears and human-wildlife relationships. Jake's story demonstrated that these magnificent predators weren't mindless killing machines to be feared and avoided, but intelligent, complex creatures capable of forming bonds and adapting to changing circumstances. Schools began organizing field trips to the rehabilitation center where Jake would tell Smokey's story and educate children about the importance of conservation and coexistence. Many of these young visitors would go on to pursue careers in wildlife biology, conservation, and environmental protection, inspired by what they'd witnessed at the ranch. The success also brought new challenges. The center received more orphaned cubs than they could handle, forcing Jake to develop partnerships with other rehabilitation facilities across the region. He trained other caretakers in his methods, sharing the hard-won wisdom he'd gained from his experience with Smokey and dozens of other bears. 5 years after Smokey's release, the Morrison Grizzly Rehabilitation Center had successfully returned 47 orphaned grizzly cubs to the wild, with a survival rate of over 85%, far higher than any previous program. The center had also become a research facility, providing valuable data about bear behavior, nutrition, and the complex relationships between humans and wildlife. The reunion happened on a crisp October morning, exactly 6 years after Jake first found Smokey collapsed on his doorstep. Jake was checking fence lines in the remote section of his property when he heard a sound that made his heart skip a beat, a low, grumbling vocalization that he recognized instantly. There, standing at the edge of the forest, less than 50 yards away, was Smokey. He was magnificent. Now fully mature, Smokey weighed well over 600 pounds and stood nearly 5 feet at the shoulder. His coat was thick and glossy, preparing for winter hibernation. But it was his eyes that confirmed what Jake's heart already knew: intelligent, calm, and filled with unmistakable recognition. For several minutes, neither moved. Jake fought every instinct that urged him to call out, to approach, to somehow bridge the distance between them. He knew that Smokey was wild now, and that any attempt to rekindle their old relationship could be dangerous for both of them. But then Smokey did something that took Jake's breath away. The great bear sat down, just as he used to do as a cub when he wanted Jake's attention. He tilted his head slightly, another familiar gesture from their time together, and then he made that same rumbling sound, softer this time, almost like a purr. Jake slowly raised his hand in a small wave, the same gesture he'd used to say goodbye 6 years earlier. Smokey watched for another minute, then stood and walked calmly back into the forest. But just before disappearing into the trees, he looked back one more time. The encounter lasted less than 10 minutes, but it answered questions that had been weighing on Jake for years. Smokey hadn't forgotten their bond, but he also hadn't been damaged by it. He was exactly what Jake had hoped he would become, a wild, free grizzly bear who carried within him the memory of human kindness without being dependent on it. That evening, Jake called Dr. Chen to report the sighting. He came back to say hello, Jake told her, his voice thick with emotion. He wanted me to know he's okay. Through her research network, Dr. Chen had been following Smokey's progress over the years through occasional Park Service reports and camera trap footage. Smokey had established himself as a dominant male in the region, had been seen with several different females during mating seasons, and had successfully raised at least 2 litters of cubs to independence. He was, by every measure, a conservation success story. Smokey's story had implications that reached far beyond wildlife rehabilitation. It became a case study in conservation biology, demonstrating that successful human-wildlife relationships were possible even with apex predators.
Universities began incorporating Jake's methods into their wildlife management curricula, and conservation organizations used his story to advocate for more nuanced approaches to human-wildlife conflict. The economic impact was significant as well. The Morrison Grizzly Rehabilitation Center brought thousands of visitors to the region each year, generating revenue for local businesses and creating jobs in rural Montana. More importantly, it created a model for conservation tourism that benefited both local communities and wildlife populations. Jake's transformation from isolated rancher to internationally recognized conservationist was equally remarkable. He authored 2 books about his experiences, with proceeds funding expansion of the rehabilitation program. He testified before Congress about the need for increased funding for wildlife conservation programs. He spoke at conferences around the world, always emphasizing the same message, that conservation isn't about keeping humans and wildlife separate, but about finding ways for them to coexist respectfully. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the broader conversation about grizzly bear conservation. Smokey's story helped shift public opinion about these magnificent predators from fear-based thinking to understanding and respect. This change in perception led to increased support for habitat protection, more nuanced wildlife management policies, and greater funding for research and conservation programs. The ripple effects continue to this day. Former visitors to the rehabilitation center have gone on to become park rangers, wildlife biologists, and conservation advocates. Children who met Jake and heard Smokey's story have grown up to pursue careers in environmental protection. The center's success has inspired similar programs in other states and countries, creating a network of rehabilitation facilities that have saved hundreds of orphan bears. Now, in his late 60s, Jake Morrison has had many years to reflect on that October morning when he found a dying grizzly cub on his doorstep. In interviews, he often says that saving Smokey changed his life far more than he changed Smokey's. "I thought I was just helping a helpless animal," Jake reflects. "But what I learned was that the boundary between wild and domestic, between human and animal, isn't as clear-cut as we like to think. Smokey taught me that respect and love can coexist with wildness and freedom." Dr. Chen, now director of the state's Wildlife Rehabilitation Program, often speaks about the scientific implications of Jake's success. What Jake accomplished challenged our fundamental assumptions about bear behavior and human-wildlife relationships. It forced us to develop new protocols and approaches that have improved conservation outcomes across the board.
The lessons learned from Smokey's story extend beyond wildlife conservation. They speak to broader themes about compassion, courage, and the willingness to challenge conventional thinking when faced with extraordinary circumstances. Jake's decision to help a dying cub, despite legal and personal risks, demonstrated the kind of moral courage that conservation desperately needs. The story also highlights the importance of individual action in addressing larger environmental challenges. Jake wasn't a trained wildlife biologist or a conservation professional when he found Smokey. He was simply a compassionate person who saw a creature in need and decided to help. His actions ultimately led to systematic changes that have benefited countless other animals and contributed to our understanding of human-wildlife relationships.
Today, the Morrison Grizzly Rehabilitation Center continues its work, though Jake has gradually transitioned into a more advisory role as younger staff members take on primary caregiving responsibilities. The center has expanded beyond grizzly bears to include other orphaned wildlife, from black bears to mountain lions to wolves. Smokey, now approaching his 10th birthday, remains a presence in the Greater Glacier National Park ecosystem. Park biologists continue to monitor him through occasional GPS collar updates and camera trap footage. He's estimated to have fathered at least 12 cubs with different females, contributing his successful genes to the regional population. Recent genetic analysis has revealed something remarkable about Smokey's offspring. They show greater adaptability to human presence than typical wild bears, while maintaining appropriate wariness. This suggests that Smokey's unique upbringing may have passed on beneficial behavioral traits that help bears navigate an increasingly human-dominated landscape. The Rehabilitation Center now welcomes over 20,000 visitors annually, generating significant revenue for local conservation programs. More importantly, it serves as an educational hub that helps thousands of people develop deeper understanding and appreciation for wildlife. Many visitors leave with a transformed perspective on human-wildlife relationships, carrying that message back to their communities. Jake's story has been featured in documentaries, books, and countless news articles around the world. But he remains humble about his role in Smokey's success. "I just did what anybody with a heart would do," he often says. "The remarkable thing isn't that I helped Smokey. It's that Smokey taught me so much about what's possible when we approach wildlife with respect and compassion instead of fear." As climate change, habitat loss, and human encroachment continue to threaten wildlife populations around the world, Smokey's story offers a message of hope. It demonstrates that humans and wildlife can coexist in ways that benefit both species. It shows that individual acts of compassion can lead to systematic change that improves conservation outcomes. Most importantly, it challenges us to reconsider our relationship with the natural world. For too long, conservation has been based on the premise that humans and wildlife must be kept separate, that the only way to protect wild animals is to minimize their contact with people. Smokey's story suggests a more nuanced approach, one that recognizes the potential for respectful coexistence. This doesn't mean that every wild animal should be treated like Smokey. The specific circumstances of his rescue and rehabilitation were unique, and attempting to replicate them without proper expertise and facilities would be dangerous and counterproductive. But it does suggest that we need more creative, compassionate approaches to wildlife conservation that acknowledge the complex realities of our shared world. The story also highlights the critical importance of supporting wildlife rehabilitation programs and the dedicated people who run them. These programs serve as crucial safety nets for orphaned and injured wildlife, giving them second chances at wild, free lives. They also serve as bridges between human and wildlife communities, fostering understanding and support for conservation efforts. Today, as Jake Morrison sits on his porch in the evening light, he sometimes sees a familiar silhouette moving through the distant trees. He can't always be sure it's Smokey, The forest is home to many bears now. But whether it's Smokey himself or one of his descendants, Jake feels a deep satisfaction in knowing that his moment of compassion all those years ago continues